I appreciate you being here. I'm Terry Thornton. I'm Curator of Education here at the Modern, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Tuesday Evenings at the Modern. Tuesday Evenings is a weekly lecture series. I'm quite proud of it. It's free and open to the public, and it's been going on for forever. And it's something very special. I always say I do it for me, and I'm glad when other people show up. And that is so much the case tonight. As I said, weekly series. So next week, architect and director of the University of Oklahoma College of Architecture, Hans Butzer, AIA, he is here to present Architecture is a Social Act in conjunction with the Fort Worth AIA's 2018 Design Awards. So interesting that that's the lecture that precedes tonight's presentation, titled What Remains? The Legacy and Future of Confederate Monuments. And we're going to go a little off script tonight and begin with a studio. I'm not having a stroke, right? I keep doing that. We're going to start with a video, and then we'll get
What
back
advice?
Our Confederate soldiers, that's what this was for. They gave their lives to the South in her time of need. What was the need? To have slaves. That's why we're here every day. We're gonna fight this thing, and we want to get that thing moved.
In 2016, the SPLC released a report estimating about 718 Confederate statues and monuments across America. Included in that statistic was the 100-year-old Confederate statue sitting here in the town square of Denton, Texas. I'm getting ready to meet Willy Hudspeth, a local resident who for the past 20 of those years has been protesting its existence. Willy began his fight to remove the statue in 1998, and ever since then, he's made fighting for its removal a weekly part of his life. On every Sunday afternoon, he holds a protest next to the monument. And every Tuesday, he's in the courtroom speaking out to county officials.
I can stand here, and as long as I'm physically fit to do so, I will stand here.
For the vast majority of this time, Willy has been waging this fight by himself. However, with the spotlight on Confederate monuments, his voice has grown, and he's received some new allies in his struggle. As a result of the increased attention, Denton's court created an independent committee made up of 15 locals, including Willy, with the goal of deciding the fate of the monument. The recommendation is going to be presented publicly in just a few days.
Okay, now that we're all catching up with Willy, we decided to have this presentation tonight. As you are aware, we are in for a challenging, engaging evening with Noah Simblist, Laura Woods, and Max Krochmal, who are here to discuss and present the ways communities tell stories of communal histories through art, scholarship, archives, and the built environment. From their own personal and professional perspectives, they will delve into how we reconcile competing points of view on issues, on issues, events, and moments in time, looking at the country at large, while considering our more immediate surroundings here in the DFW Metroplex. It is our hope that this contributes to conversations already being had and perhaps igniting new conversations. So if you guys want to come on up, we have Noah Simblist. Noah's work as a curator, writer, artist, focuses on art and politics. He has contributed to publications including Art in America, Art Journal, Modern Painters, Terremoto, and is editing a book to be published by the University of Chicago Press by Tania Bruguera, The Francis Effect. In 2016, he was the co-curator and co-producer for New Cities, Future Ruins, a convening that invited artists, designers, and thinkers to reimagine and engage the extreme urbanism of America's Western Sunbelt. He is also chair of painting and printmaking and associate professor of art at Virginia Commonwealth University, and we're so glad to have him here tonight. Lauren Woods, her hybrid media projects in film, video, and sound installation, public interventions, and site-specific work engage history as a lens by which to view the socio-politics of the present. Her work, Drinking Fountain #1, a new media monument to the American Civil Rights Movement, past and present activist organizers, and the spirit of resistance, is located underneath the remnants of a rediscovered Jim Crow white-only sign in the Dallas County Records Building in Dallas, Texas. And more recently, Lauren's multimedia installation addressing police brutality and the killing of African Americans by police officers, American Monument, at the University Art Museum at California State University, Long Beach, was paused in light of the museum's director, Kimberly Meyer, who invited and worked with Lauren on American Monument, being abruptly fired. Lauren can elaborate on this tonight if she sees fit, and we have time. Some of you may already know all about that, and we're very happy to have Lauren with us tonight. Dr. Max Krochmal is an American historian, associate professor of history, and chair of the Department of Comparative Race and Ethnic Studies at Texas Christian University. He won the Organization of American Historians Frederick Jackson Turner Award in 2017, and the Ramirez Family Award for Most Significant Scholarly Book from the Texas Institute of Letters for his book, Blue Texas, The Making of a Multiracial Democratic Coalition in the Civil Rights Era. Krochmal is the founder and director of the Civil Rights in Black and Brown Oral History Project, a statewide collaborative research initiative and digital humanities website. So with that, I will begin our conversation tonight by welcoming, I would like to begin our conversation tonight by welcoming our esteemed guest. So if you would, please join me in showing our appreciation for their being here to share their insights, engaging all of us in these important issues. And let's give them a round of applause. Again, thank you so much for doing this, guys. I think it's super important. I know this is close and dear to your hearts, and it's something that we all need to be talking about. As I said, these are conversations that we're having, but I think it's time for us to have them in a more public way, and I'm so honored that the Modern can be a part of this conversation. I'm going to now serve as the inquirer, as opposed to the moderator, because the moderator would suggest that I had some knowledge or insight into tonight's subject that I do not have, but I do know how to ask questions, so that's going to be my role. That was a really stunning video that you guys chose to open tonight's panel discussion with. As I said, now that we're all equally engaged in this conversation, as Willy has been for the past, what did they say, 20 years, I think we're ready to start talking about maybe most specifically how this topic affects the DFW area. So what is the Dallas way or the Fort Worth way? What is the history of DFW, and what is this area's kind of approach to that history? What is it that we're not saying, that we're covering up, or that we are saying, or what is it we're constructing in terms of how we present ourselves? And I'm going to open that up to the table and see kind of how each of you want to maybe contribute to responding to that. Okay, we're going to start with...
Start at the end.
Okay,
Right, so,
Max, you have some particular insight into Fort Worth. I mean, I know you have
Sure.
a much broader insight than that, but what can you tell us about the DFW area and how we're presenting ourselves?
well, I'll try not to carry on too long about this. Am I on here? Y'all hear me okay? No?
Are all the mics on?
Yeah,
Yes?
Okay.
That one makes it like it's
I think you're just turning.
Somebody's trying to silence you, Max.
Is yours up or down? I'll use this one. We'll share. All right. So, yeah, I could talk all day probably about this, but I'll try to be quick. The Fort Worth Way and the Dallas Way, right, are two rather not creative phrases that describe a similar pattern in the two cities. One in which they tell themselves these stories about the lack of open conflict around race in their history, and I would say class conflict and other forms of conflict too, but particularly about race. And the story goes that Dallas and Fort Worth's businessmen, all men, were so enlightened that they managed to anticipate that racial change was taking place around the country, and in order to avoid conflict and riots and sit-ins, which they conflate in their own cities, they were proactive in making certain adjustments in integrating their institutions, workplaces, and so forth. It's a lie, right? It's a very common story, but it's not true. There were, in fact, direct action demonstrations in both cities. There's a sustained pattern of police brutality in both cities. There's systematic denial of educational opportunities, political access, you name it, in both places. And so what the Fort Worth Way and the Dallas Way have served to do instead is to mask the very real conflicts that have taken place in both cities, the unequal distribution of resources and power in both places, and also to help facilitate elites incorporating Black and Latino race leaders, sort of self-described, self-appointed race leaders as intermediaries and diplomats who can negotiate things behind closed doors instead of those things being talked about more transparently. But the power is still firmly held in the hands of a few white elites. And in Fort Worth, that's a very few, and so that we can start there. I'll just say quickly, right now tonight, as we speak, it's standing room only at the Fort Worth City Council meeting, where, among other agenda items, the task force on race and culture that was appointed a year ago is presenting its draft recommendations. And I've heard from city staff that those recommendations are rather controversial, and I think many people in the community think it's not going anywhere near far enough. And of course, people who protect and defend the Fort Worth Way think it's gone way too far already. I'll leave it there.
That's great.
So one thing just about a kind of format, like so the video that we started with as a kind of experiential setting the tone for everything is because often the way that we talk about these questions of history, questions about race, is in the past year has focused on monuments since the events in Charlottesville. But the larger question is sort of how we approach history in general and how it's signified, and then how those symbols or signs actually act on us or like recreate certain systems, as opposed to sort of documenting systems that exist. So in essence, one of the questions is not just what do monuments do, should they exist or should they not exist, but actually like how do we approach history in general? So this notion of the Dallas Way or the Fort Worth Way, which is about a particular way that a system of power decides how a civic structure thinks of their own history, right? Like a small group of people, a small group of elite people decide what our history is, and how that gets woven into the built environment and even into our consciousness, like that, you know, to believe that certain things existed in the past. And this is how history exists everywhere, basically. But I do think that there's something unique here that is about the kind of erasure of history, and a suppression and repression of various histories and the replacement of those erased histories with a kind of fantasy. Like I just moved from here to Virginia, which is a place that is like quite proud of its history in a lot of ways and holds on to it, But obviously, like in a place like Charlottesville, you saw what that became, right? Like it's a kind of tinderbox where in many ways, the things that were ready to be ignited were right there on the surface in the first place. Mm-hmm. Whereas here, I think they were very consciously kept at bay so that something like that wouldn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's it. No, I would just add, I mean, does Fort Worth actually have a motto? Is the Fort Worth way, because I know the Dallas way is the motto, but is that a term that comes up for Fort Worth?
It comes up in discussions of local politics. The more official motto was crafted by a booster, Eamon Carter, and it's where the West begins, which is also a story of historical erasure. Right? Fort Worth really doesn't like to talk about its history, going back to slavery, going back to the Confederacy, and so instead very much emphasizes its Western heritage and embellishes it even. So that's the official slogan. But the Fort Worth way it's really come back into use in greater form, I think, in the last couple of years, as people have begun to question some of those structures in new ways.
And I know with Dallas, the sort of the sentence that comes after that is what's good for business is good for Dallas.
Right.
And so also that it's interesting to me that, if Fort Worth claims the beginning of the West, that Dallas also attempted to co-opt that idea in terms of being the beginning of Southwest and enterprise and things like that. So that begins also the tension between the two cities.
Yeah, right. The boosterism between the two and the competition between the two have certainly fostered that, I think, yeah.
It seems like that boosterism is, and the competition also serve as a distraction to who we really are, perhaps. I mean, I've always felt like that was sort of a false, that competition never felt real to me. It felt like it was instead of talking about other more serious and important things or something. Well, Lauren, can you speak a little bit to Dallas in particular? I know you have a lot of experience in Dallas dealing with the politics there and the art in a public setting and its interaction with the politics there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, maybe this idea of repression and how it functioned with Drinking Fountain, for instance.
Okay, yeah, specifically with your work, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's interesting, again, so Dallas being, the Dallas way being what's good for Dallas, or what's good for business is good for Dallas means that different parties at different points in history were able to play the loopholes of the system. And I feel like, in a way, that's how the Drinking Fountain came about. I often think about, so the Drinking Fountain, I ended up before the Commissioner's Court while I was a student in grad school, just because they didn't know where to send me, basically. Because I called it, I was like, I called the city's art commission, asked them about proposing this project in the county records building. The city, as a municipal entity, says, well, that's not our building, we don't have anything to do with that. So at that point, I just ended up calling the county administrator's office, and everyone sort of sent me all over the bureaucracy because no one was like, we don't have art, we don't know what, we don't know, And they were like, let's just put it before the commissioner's court and see what they say. And that was the interesting loophole.
Okay.
And I often think about how this happened in a major city with a more rooted sort of system of support for art and an art commission that would usher this in. Things would have been very different. And the practice that sort of, for me, established, well, that's mine. The practice that I established through that project, which was really, it's not about the objects that we see, but it's really this relational way of working in city politics, really established itself with that project because I had to move through the bureaucracy in so many ways.
So that's the work. That's the whole piece.
Yeah, and so what's good for business is good for Dallas. So the way it was approved was that the city didn't have, or the county didn't have to pay for it. So they were like, go ahead. Right. It's good for Dallas. We don't have to pay for it. And we're solving sort of this public issue of what to do with this white-only trace that showed up all of a sudden. So, and I feel like that's sort of the general, culture in terms of Dallas city politics is that a lot of intervention from the private sphere happens through those loopholes. And then it gets sort of codified and calcified to the public once those back channels are worked.
So are most of you, or is there anybody who needs a little more explanation about this piece in particular? Do you know this piece in Dallas?
I think maybe a little.
A little bit.
Yeah, a little.
So
yeah,
okay, so 2003, in 2003, this incident happened in the county records building where a metal plate was over a white-only trace on the first floor of the records building downtown. And one day it just fell off, and this is just years of like, you know, they wouldn't want me to say disrepair or anything like that, but I mean, you know, it's marble, it's old, something wasn't screwed properly, the metal plate fell off, and revealed a preserved white-only trace that was etched into the marble wall. And so,
like it was going to be there forever. Huh?
yes, and it actually technically is there. So the county proceeded, you know, it was a sort of huge uproar and made it on CNN and a couple of other national channels because they couldn't decide what to do with it because they attempted to buff it out and they couldn't. So they tried to buff it out, it wouldn't go away. So the only way to address this would literally be to cut the marble out, which the entire first floor is marble that's, you know, at that point, you know, more than 50 years old. I would say probably 80 years old at that point. So it's an aesthetic thing. Like, do you just remove and have like another piece of marble like glued in, you know? So it became a debate within the county. There were protests and everything else. And what they found out was actually these etches were all over the building, over every water fountain in the building. And then city or county employees started coming forward with what remnants of Jim Crow were actually in their workspace that were just overlooked. So for instance, there was a man whose office was the restroom, the men's restroom, but closed off. So it was a historic door. And there was a white-only trace, there was a white-only removed sign, so a trace there in his office. So, you know, these things started sort of coming to the surface, and because they couldn't buff it out, it became this sort of contentious debate. And it took a couple of votes before they were able to get consensus. So in a 4-to-1 vote, they finally decided that they would remove all of the coverings and deem them historical places of historical significance. So not quite historical markers or things that the Texas Commission would have to deem a place of historical significance, but like just to say that we recognize this is here, we need to understand our past, to, you know, blah, blah, blah. So I was in the process when this was happening of moving to San Francisco, and I was starting grad school. So I sort of kept that, kept this in my mind. I was really active on early internet at the time, on Black Planet, like, you know, typing to people, and for the most part, the sort of discourse was like, you know, Dallas is backwards. Like, how could you even, you know, consider keeping these in the public realm? And I was always of the sort of side that said we should, you know, but I also understood that we couldn't just leave them as is. There's something that had to happen. So in grad school, when I started getting into issues of monumentality and really sort of diving into that, that's when I had the idea to come back and propose this, what I call a new media monument, which is I proposed that I took the fountain, turned it into an interactive video playing monument. So when you went for water, you pushed the button, the fountain, instead of the water coming on, a projection inside of the fountain came on, and it was a series of newsreel clips from different archives that I sourced all over the country of direct action. And then when that went off, the water came on. And so you know, in 2005, I ended up proposing it. The commissioners court were like, okay, as long as we don't have to pay for it. But then there was a slight debate about like whether I could withhold water from like Texas public in the middle of summer, and like nobody drinks from water fountains, but you know, it became an issue at that point. And then it took me about 8 years to actually launch the project, because I literally had to learn how to be an art commission of one. I had no sort of institutional support formally. I had different partnerships, but I had to raise that entire budget. I had to learn everything that goes into a public, you know, how to launch a public work in the public sphere, getting liability insurance, like all of that. So 8 years later, I was sort of at my wit's end. I moved back to Dallas. I was in residence at Central Track, and I was told, you just need to come to Dallas to raise the rest of your money. I had pretty much gotten a huge chunk of national funding, but for whatever reasons, I couldn't tap into the local and regional private foundations and families. So I moved back here with that intention. They were like, you just have to show up and shake hands. I did, and didn't get any money. And I think I literally wrote about 30 grants in Texas over a period of 3 years, and none of it came back. And this was before Dallas faced race with their initiative. This was before Obama was elected, or right when he was elected. No, it was before Obama was elected. So people weren't really trying to deal with this. And then there was the question of whether this was art, whether it was documentary, whether it was preservation. So there was, and then there was the issue of there not being sort of like fiscal, institutions with fiscal sponsorships like set up in Texas. So I had like a New York fiscal sponsor and people were like, we're not giving money to New York, you know. So it was a lot of things. And so I had all kinds of interesting things come back. The most interesting was somebody was interested in the project, but they were like, my grandfather, this is his money, and he was like a racist, so I don't think this is gonna work. So needless to say, I was like at a very low point in 2013, and I got a call from the county, and they were preparing for JFK's 50th anniversary memorial. And they basically were like, we want this to launch with the JFK 50.
Something to distract from that, huh?
Because that was another thing in terms of history and how a city deals with that. I mean, that was really sort of controversial.
Yeah, that's
different funders were creating sides.
What do we want to distract from most?
Right, yeah. I mean, from what I knew, people literally through the grapevine were blacklisting people for participating in that, you know? So that's another thing we can talk about. So needless to say, so the county, you know, they asked me what I minimally needed to get the sculpture up, and I told them, and so they ended up funding that last part just so I could get the sculpture up, which is the first part of the project.
So if you haven't seen this, you know, you do have to wait for the water. So there's that. It forces you to wait, which I have to say is a valued thing now, to actually have to wait for something. And then, am I correct that the image is of police using the water hose on?
So yeah, I do have the Birmingham campaign, which are the famous image, most famous action, which was when you know, the police were attacking with the dogs, and the firemen were attacking with water hoses, and so and it's you know, it's a nice sort of synthesis of the elements that were already there, because literally the fountain is next to a fire hose cabinet and all that sort of stuff. So
yeah. So you understand why Lauren is here tonight. She makes perfect sense on this panel. Well, so we kind of have a sense of Dallas and Fort Worth and maybe what the true histories are, and we could spend all night just on that. But maybe, I don't know, am I jumping the gun if we start talking about how to approach this in a more nuanced way? Like, what are some of the subtleties? What are some of these underlying issues that kind of get just breezed over? That you know, the easy way maybe is to take something down, or to, or is in fact that the hard thing, and it's what we need to do? Can you maybe all jump in on that a little bit?
Well, one thing I was going to say is that there's something in Lauren's project that I think raises the question of what gets erased and what the impulse to erase it is, right? You know, so like for the whites only sign, for one person, it might be to sort of erase what seems an uncomfortable past that one might be associated with. Meaning, like for someone who is white, who grew up in the city, had white privilege within that historical trajectory, and to erase that is actually to mitigate culpability, right? Like, so that in essence, like, I don't have to deal with that potential, but then another might be actually to erase it because it seems like it has a kind of racist agency, right? That it actually perpetuates the impulses of the Jim Crow era. That it is a reminder that white supremacy didn't end when the civil rights struggle had sort of had some possibilities of shifting things out of the Jim Crow era. So there's two actually opposite impulses towards the same erasure, right? And so the question of like whether to actually allow it to disappear or whether to revive it or to hold on to it as it is, you get trapped in sort of a weird binary, because obviously, like, the binary of, like, take it down versus leave it up isn't so simple.
Right.
Yeah. Well, if I could add, I'm not an art historian, so I might be on a bit of a limb here, but for me, that we don't want to erase any trace of it, right? So that's what's such a cool project, to take like this hidden history that reveals itself and to make it known again. One project I like a lot here in Fort Worth is down at the TMP station, where they've created a whole sort of Black history exhibit monument to the history of African American railroad workers working on those lines. But also there's a bench, right, that signifies the segregation of the waiting room that you're standing in when you're looking at it, right? And so it's a way that they can approach the history and remind us that history existed without celebrating it and without giving it that kind of power that you were talking about, Noah. And then also simultaneously it kind of features a lot of these great path-breaking individuals and organizations who use the railroads and the railroad unions and the surrounding communities to build power for African American communities. So to me, that's like a nice way to think about the task at hand. So that's on the one hand, right? How do we think about Jim Crow? Fort Worth and Dallas both like to pretend that Jim Crow never even happened in these places, or if it did, it was just like some kind of little misunderstanding, right? And it was, we need to communicate better about our differences, right? But Jim Crow wasn't a system of separation, right, or of apartness. It was a system of domination, right, where one group gets systematic privileges conferred on it and the other one systematic disadvantages. And that's something that the public discourse hasn't dealt with, right, in any meaningful way. I want to say a couple other quick things. So, for me, the question of memory, I think we have to, and maybe we'll come back to this, think beyond just even the black and white kind of terms we've been using so far, or the black and white of our history, but thinking more broadly about how do we represent the entire sort of project of settler colonialism that landed us here, right? That where did these towns come from? Who did they replace? How are they populated? How are they developed? And who are the winners and losers in that longer history? And so for me, that makes all of the questions more complicated. And one of the things we talked about, the three of us, on a conference call a couple of weeks ago, was that in some ways Confederate monuments are the easy one to talk about, right? That the Confederate monuments are so in your face, they're so blatantly racist, right? They're so much about celebrating that history in this very distorted way. As probably all of you know, right? None of them were actually built right after the Civil War. They really had nothing to do with the Confederate soldiers, right? They were built to create the system of Jim Crow around the turn of the century and then to shore it up again by the mid-20th century. And so, I guess I think, clearly we should take them down, and we need to come up with new people to celebrate and new heroes and new ways to commemorate the history of slavery in particular, right? But we also need to be moving beyond that and thinking about our culture and what does it choose to celebrate, as you said, and what does it choose to deny.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I feel like, is the Longhorns in here?
Yeah.
Right in Pioneer Park, maybe it's not in here.
Yeah, they're further back.
Okay. Right in Pioneer Park, as we're talking about the Confederate Memorial there, we should be equally offended.
Other way, I guess.
Okay, let's see, how many we go back?
There.
We should be equally offended by this. I mean, yes, it's the world's largest landscape sculpture monument, according to whatever internet source. But to talk about how Dallas has rebranded itself at that moment in time. This was literally, so this Longhorn, what is it even called? I'm totally blanking. It's Longhorn jumping over water trail thing.
That's what they should call it.
That's down by City Hall. It was literally it was put in place, a $9 million project to stop a development deal from happening. So, and if anyone's here, if Greg Metz or anyone's here, there was actually there was a group of artists that sued the city over this sculpture because The owner of the, I think it's Adolphus, didn't want the Omni being built on that plot of land because it would mess with his business. So
Whatever's good for...
For whatever's good for, yeah. So he donated this sculpture to the city to have this, but also, like, we never had the Shawnee Trail, that's not part of Dallas's history, right? But the way they justified it was by going to the tourist board and saying, what do tourists want to see? And tourists were like, we thought we'd see cowboys and more of that stuff here, you know? And so this was like used to justify sort of, once again, tweaking sort of the history and brand of Dallas that literally has very little to do with like cowboy and that sort of thing that Fort Worth actually has more claim to.
Only a little bit.
And then let's not even talk about, I mean, then we're not also talking about the fact that this is literally representing like indigenous genocide, if we really think about what this is representing. So while we're protesting the Confederate monuments, we're literally leaving this off of the discussion. So if we really are starting to look at all these things, we can't we're opening up a Pandora's box where we should be addressing a lot.
Yeah,
you know?
I think the metal thing covering up the whites only just fell off. Yeah. So, what do we do with that? Like, you know, of course, like I think probably a lot of people in this room, we want answers, and I know that, but, you know, where do we have those discussions? How do we, you know, if taking it down and the Confederate monuments are in fact the easy thing, how do we delve deeper? How do we do the harder thing and get to a better result?
Well, one thing is to put new monuments up, right? To actually start commemorating so much of the history that's been lost or systematically erased and forgotten. You know, I just showed a marker from from the Matanza, from the border war in 1915, right, and along the Rio Grande border, where you know, state orchestrated violence systematically. Here's another image from it, right? These are members of the Texas Rangers who were massacring Mexican American landowners in South Texas as part of a broader series of ethnic conflict, right, sanctioned by the state. So there's one example, right? So a group has done really wonderful work. It's called the Refusing to Forget Project, and they've been documenting this state orchestrated violence, and as well as, you know, some of the land claims and whatever else. They did an exhibition at the Bob Bullock a couple of years ago. And really just wonderful work, and they succeeded in getting this marker actually placed one of the spots where there was particularly egregious violence. So I think that's one thing, right, is to start actually marking other histories, and not just massacres, but positive things, if we want to think of it that way. So another slide I have in here somewhere is of down the road in Cleburne, Texas, where in 1886, ordinary farmers came together, you know, in massive numbers, and charted out a path for democratizing the economy in the nation, right, through building alliances of farmers that ultimately resulted in the People's Party, the populist movement, right, the greatest grassroots movement of the 19th century, which was even interracial, right, in many of its places, where white farmers abandoned the Democratic Party, the party of the Confederacy, for a period of time in order to put their economic interests first, right? Like, to me, that's an empowering, important history right down the road. And let me see if I can find it. This is going to happen again. Okay, no, this is it. So this is Cleburne, Johnson County. So that's the Farmers Alliance, like the most good for the most people. It was founded in Lampasas County, but then the major gathering, there were wagon trains stretching for miles for farmers to come in 1886, and they put out a series of demands about nationalizing the railroads and the other utilities and so forth. But the city of Cleburne, right, to the extent that it has public art, wait, I'm in a window here, and Johnson County, this is what it looks like, right? There's your oil rig, right? There's that guy playing baseball. There's some cattle drives. Oh yeah, the train, the very enemy of the populists, right, being memorialized. Wild Frontier, Trail Dust and Rails, and it's this big mural. Oh, and then this is there too, the Gone with the Wind Museum, which I don't know why that's in Cleburne in the first place. Except that they're really hanging on to that slave heritage, right? And that beautiful old South of magnolias and moonlight, and not actually dealing with what could be a really empowering, more accurate history of that community.
I mean, part of it, I think there's a number of answers to your question. Like, on the one hand, you're like, you know, what do we do? What's the other option? one thing is like, how do we tell history? You know, how do we show, how do we help a community participate in various histories that have been suppressed? So, you know, that's archives, that's storytelling, that's film, that's radio programs, that's events like this, that's workshops, that's, you know, integrations into school curriculum, that's mural, you know, it's not just about the bronze statue, you know, and so that range of possible strategies of addressing history is equal to the huge range of actually addressing structural racism, right? Like the structure itself is the thing that needs to be addressed. You know, to actually look at the one node, the piece of bronze, is to, you know, to basically miss the forest for the one tree, right? It's like thinking that actually represents the whole thing, whereas actually it's on the ground you're standing, in the air you're breathing, it's everywhere around you. So like, and even that range of activities is just scratching the surface of how to start it. It's no accident. There was a few, after Charlottesville, there were a bunch of activists who started to deface the monuments in Richmond, which has this street called Monument Avenue, and which is just filled with monuments. Yeah. Oh, this is the rest of the globe, which we'll get to later.
In our next lecture.
I'm guessing the wrong
direction. I know.
Yeah.
So in these protesters were Black Lives Matter protesters who essentially were linking protest to police violence, to the legacies of the Confederacy, right? So like, one is about history, one is about like today.
Right.
You know, like somebody literally getting shot today. And putting the two together, showing that these things are connected. So I deface this thing because this thing is because the crime scene was cleaned up. Like, it went away. But that monument stayed. So actually, it could be used as something to remind the public that legacy actually lives on every single day.
Which is why I don't think it's enough to get rid of them.
Right.
I mean, we get rid of them and then put up a park bench, and that actually doesn't address what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's always like discussion about whether you should contextualize them instead, right? And so far I haven't seen one that I thought put it in its proper context, right? Which I'm not even sure what that would look like, a jail cell around it maybe. But
So
I think...
so with the fountain, that's what they initially did when the county decided to remove all of them. They put these, laser printout on plexi to contextualize it, right? And Denton has done that. McKinney has done that in their courthouse with white-only signs. And
Ole Miss.
One of the images in here from Baltimore. Baltimore was one of the cities that, after their commission, they attempted to contextualize with signs in their process, and people were still defacing and saying that's not enough. And the reason it's not enough is because it actually doesn't undo the power of that object. It's a small sign next to a sculpture standing how many ever feet above us actually doesn't address the technology built into that sculpture that artists do know what that means, right? But the larger public sort of doesn't understand why that object has power,
Well, and yeah, right. Like, it's one thing to want to record and exhibit our history and to learn from it, right? But these monuments are about celebration, right? They're not neutral. Or when we name a street after somebody, it's not neutral. And so, I'm not sure how you contextualize that either, right? You have to. I think you just change the name.
But that's been one of these issues that like New Orleans has been dealing with, for instance. Like, the city had the agency to be able to remove a series of 4 monuments, and one of the most famous was the Lee Monument, which I can find here somewhere, and. When they removed the Lee Monument, like basically there's this one figure on the top of this huge pedestal. This is what you're left with.
Right.
which is amazing.
And it's, you know, in terms of the built environment, in terms of urban infrastructure, it's called Lee Circle. It's a roundabout that at the center of it has this sort of grassy hilltop with steps that go up to this huge edifice that on the top. So yes, this piece of bronze was taken away.
So there.
But you still have the power mechanism that held that bronze in place. You still have the representation of power and white supremacy, which I think is fascinating to actually address when people are ready to address it. I mean, that's what Baltimore ended up. They've left their plinths up, and they're like allowing sort of a settling period to happen, so people can actually have like dialogue about what all of this means, rather than what's happening here, which is this push to just get rid of everything immediately. You know, I know that there's been calls in Dallas to get rid of the Lee plinth. You know, mainly because that's a valuable object when whatever they decide to do with the sculpture, you know, sell it or put it in somebody's Illuminati collection. I'm not going to say that.
That's probably what would happen. Yeah.
This is being recorded.
We're not mentioning any
names. It is being recorded. It's being recorded.
It becomes something valuable, you know? But the thing is that, like, so they don't want it destroyed because it's of value. But it actually is not allowing the public to live and deal with this moment if we are so quick to try to take it away and erase it.
Yeah.
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that in New Orleans, one thing that they did as a strategy in response to this is there's a group called Paper Monuments.
Yeah.
Basically a group of architects and urbanists who have actually been commissioned by the city to run a series of charrettes with various communities within the city to try to understand, like, what should be memorialized, what should there be a monument? If there is a monument, what should it look like? How should the city reconfigure itself? And it uses a strategy that architects and urbanists use all the time, where you begin with these charrettes, just conversations, and then.
And who comes to these charrettes? I mean, how do you make that? I mean, how's that determined?
It's basically community organizing. You know, like you go to a certain neighborhood, you knock on doors, you have flyers, you call people, and basically you try to get as many people in a given neighborhood to come to that one. And then you do another one in another neighborhood, and another one in another neighborhood. And the way that they produce something from that's why it's called paper monuments, is that they produce these posters essentially, and design them collaboratively, so it's not just a designer that's designing, it's a designer who's helping facilitate an image that's collectively made by a given neighborhood that's a vision of their own future, what they want it to look like.
That sounds so good, but I can see that going so wrong.
It works.
Yeah, and then they will plaster those posters, but they weed paste them in a given neighborhood. So it's temporary, but it's helping to visualize a different design future.
Okay, so then you have this temporary, designed sort of from the collective.
Yeah. And they were actually employed by the city to come up with a strategic plan for what to do with the legacy of the monuments.
And it's being funded by Ford Foundation as well.
So what to do with the...
What to do with this?
What to do with this, I see.
The ballot.
Yeah.
I like the idea of pausing for some dialogue, right? And maybe that's weird enough that it forces people to have that conversation for a little while.
Yeah.
Leave something weird there that will cause people to ask. Because that's the biggest thing, is to actually... to get people to ask, to get people to go up and read that plaque, I mean, and the things that are in our environment, right? We're just comfortable with them. I mean, we didn't even know how, we stopped thinking about how offensive our environment is.
Well, and I'm sorry, I would just say I think it's ubiquitous, right? It is, the monuments are kind of the most in-your-face version, right? But if you look a little more closely, there's so many different forms in which slavery and genocide and settler colonialism are being celebrated in our culture, right? So we have, down the road here, the Old South Pancake House. Like, what is the Old South they're talking about? You know, we have the Texas Rangers baseball team. Well, I just showed you a photo of the Texas Rangers, right? Like, you know, it's much of this is hidden in plain sight. And so, yeah, I think to me, the monuments are a wonderful opportunity to kind of start making those interventions in the larger culture to raise the questions of how ubiquitous it is, to point to the underlying issues of inequality and structural racism that you mentioned, and then to think collaboratively in these communities about how do you create a vision of, you know, who you are, an artistic representation of who you are and who you want to be as a community. But I think part of that is that, you know, you talked about the funding piece, right? Like, as long as we're running around with our hat in hand asking Ford Foundation or the Illuminati to fund these things, you know, like, even if we get a really cool piece of art, we haven't really dealt with those underlying power relations. So, I think we have to think about that creatively too.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that was why it was really special for me for the fountain to actually, like, a part of funding to come from the city, because that meant that there was an investment.
Yeah.
There was a buy-in.
For the project. And this sort of came up with another project that later I worked on with Cynthia Mulcahy, who's here in the audience. We were working on a project about Negro parks, and it was commissioned from a private foundation. But we got to a point where the foundation was censoring the material.
Right.
And because it was privately funded, that was what we were dependent on. But really, from the beginning, we both sort of had the idea that somehow this needed to get out of the realm of private funding hands. And so, you know, where it is now, it sort of stalls out. But like when we do restart it again, there has to be an investment from the public for it to actually be cared for. Even I mean, the fountain is cared for because the maintenance workers worked on it. The county people who work in the building steward it every day. And so with the building is under reconstruction now, you know, the architects weren't trying to actually make a place for it to come back. And it was the people who came and said, where's the fountain? You know? And so they're now contacting me to put it into the design plan.
So we just have to get these things into people's consciousness.
I was going to say one thing. So literally the next project that I had in my 25-year-old naive grad school mind had wanted to work on after I launched the fountain. So this was 2006 or 7 when I came up with this concept, was literally Confederate monuments before we got into this moment about Confederate monuments. And what I wanted to propose, I wanted to, you know, launch the fountain, and then I was like, my next project will be this Lee monument in Lee Park or Oaklawn Park. And the idea was actually what's starting to happen. The idea was like, how do you get people to recognize or to actually look at what's in their built environment?
Right.
That statue had been overlooked for so long. And so it was a simple concept. I was like, let's reveal it. So people notice this sort of like black mass, and then we'll slowly raise it up and actually study the sculpture. And so it's interesting to see, like, you know, how makeshift this is already happening in the discourse, because, you know, as people are sort of making plans to take things down, they can't do it fast enough. They're covering it up with plastic bags or building structures around it. And so I think that that's actually a really potentially useful strategy. So, and that can like save us from making really rash decisions of just take it down. Like, how about we just cover them up? You know, I mean, when I was watching the whole Lee monument sort of process unveil, I went to the park one night with a local journalist, Lindsay Nett, and we were sitting there and we were like, you know, what would be a simple intervention that would have some sort of statement that would take away a little bit of the power? Because, like, I mean, the statue's kind of gorgeous that night. I mean, I hate to say it, you know. It's really beautifully lit. It's like this weird, strange calm. And so we're like, what happens when you just turn off the lights? Like, what kind of statement is that, you know? And so I think that there could be little interventions that start to signal a process that needs to take place that needs to be public. But we're sort of in this really like heated moment of this or that, you know, this side or that side, and we're making some really strange alliances to get work done, you know?
Right. Well, and that does seem to be the way we as humans operate. We overreact, and then we begin to understand our actions, and I think that's a beautiful solution. This is obviously not enough time to solve our problems. I know you came here hoping you'd leave with all of our problems solved, but I would just, and this may be unfair to try to close with this, but just touch on maybe your insights into are there any global analogs to the Confederate monument battles in Texas and in the U.S.? Think of South Africa, post-colonial Latin America, post-1989 Eastern Europe. Do we have lessons there that we can look at, think about, and maybe that's what we'll leave it with tonight, and then we'll open it up for questions after that.
So we have a bunch of examples here, but I'm actually going to point to one that's not global as a way to illustrate a global example. So this is, you know, the sort of famous image from the Charlottesville events, and the thing that I was very struck by was its performative qualities, right? Like sort of the ritualistic performance around the monument. That, you know, the performance was actually choreographed by white supremacists, but it still was an impulse that basically said that the sculpture isn't enough. It needs to either be activated or deactivated through some kind of performative turn. And there's a group that I've worked with in the past called Public Movement that's based in Tel Aviv that has done a lot of these kinds of works with monuments in Poland, in Germany, that often are looking at the way that the Holocaust is memorialized and monumentalized, and literally both, how a memorial can actually become a monument, meaning like how something that is supposed to be a signifier of grief actually becomes a mechanism for state power, right? But they do that through using choreographies that are often used by states, right? Like where, you know, things that we think of often in exaggerated terms like goose stepping or things like that that might be tied to fascism. There's all sorts of choreographies of political life, and those are like parallel to the way that monuments function. So anyway, that's my example.
Are you going to show?
Should we show some of these others? Yeah. That was an intervention.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, in post-1989, you know, after there were all of these spurts of action against Soviet occupation that ultimately became, you know, signified post-89 when images of Stalin and Lenin were taken down and destroyed. Like the destruction of the monument was tied literally to a certain kind of emancipation. But similarly in sort of post-colonial Latin America, thinking about sort of like the toppling of the conquistador, you know, that this was a signifier of the colonial reality, and that could potentially become something else.
Yeah, and there's examples in South America where that becomes material for the new monument. So in Paraguay, there's let me see. It was, so in Paraguay when the dictator, Alberto, I can't say his name, Stroessner or something, it's not a Spanish name, so I can't pronounce it, but you know, he had, you know, tens of statues and monuments to him all over the city, and so when the city decided to deal with that, those monuments toppling became material for new monuments. So you literally have, like in 1991, Carlos Colombino took and basically broke up one of the statues and then sort of put it into the structure where it literally looks like it's being compacted and like forced together. So that became sort of the thing that symbolized what that history actually, you know, so without erasing this history, it actually acknowledged it. And then I'm totally having like complete brain blanks right now, but there's another monument, the Monument to the Dead, and I think it's in Tunisia. It's North Africa, post-French colonial, and the original monument was given by the French as like a sort of a peace offering, but then when sort of people became more political and like the revolution happened, people were like, you know, F this, you know, so they took that monument, actually filled it with concrete, you know, and so instead of, and they left certain remnants of that original monument poking through, and so there's a slow erosion that's also happening. So these things actually all over the world, you know, with a longer history than the United States, they've had to deal with what these symbolic, monuments that really signify certain state power, colonialism, or whatever. They've had to deal with this sort of history. And I think the impulse has been more than not to actually deal with it, not just to throw it away.
Right. It sounds like that they've demanded a kind of catharsis that you don't get with erasure.
Yeah, another example, I think I have a couple pictures from it at the Voortrekker Monument in Pretoria in South Africa. You know, it was a monument, it's in there somewhere, a monument, you know, built to celebrate the Afrikaners when they took over, right? And it has these great
See if you can find it.
images, paintings inside. No, that's not it. You'll be surprised
That's the
though,
artist
it
who
actually
made
looks
the
exactly the
Longhorn.
same.
That's the artist who made the Longhorn.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Same artist?
He was really into Civil War Confederate paintings.
Yeah, so I mean, I think South Africa is a really interesting comparison because, and sorry, this is kind of small, but this is one of them. Thank you. And this is actually commemorating the conquest, right? When the Afrikaner settlers crossed the Orange River and beat back the African indigenous folk and took over, right? And then this one, the next is actually celebrating the end of the Boer War, the union of the Afrikaners and the English, right, which was their big civil war in the late 19th century. And essentially what they resolved when they settled that war and had this nice party was that they could get along just fine as long as their new state was built on the subjection of black Africans. And that's exactly what happened in the United States, right? And the North and South finally decided we can get along, we can have a unified economy as long as African Americans are not part of it, right? Or only there at the bottom to support it, right? Their exploited labor is central to the system. And we are okay with the South producing things however they produce as long as there's railroad lines moving north and bringing the goods north, right? So what they did in South Africa, like the Voortrekker Monument stands, these paintings are still there, but they added a new wing, right, to the grounds where they have a post-94 ANC-oriented discussion about some of these same issues and a memorial to the Africans who participated in the Boer Wars as well. And more broadly in South Africa, right, they had the Truth and Reconciliation process. Right. Whatever its flaws, it did force them to actually confront some of that history head on. They ended up renaming a whole lot of municipalities as a unit of government around indigenous black names, black African names, while still retaining some of the legacies of conquest of the settler colonialism from both the Dutch and the English. So to me, that's an interesting model that we could think more about. But the other thing that they did in South Africa is they wrote a new constitution. Right? They decided we're going to start over with this state, right? That we need to be explicitly pluralist, that we need to denounce our history of slavery, of conquest, of economic exploitation, of apartheid. And we've never had that conversation here.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I was about to say. I mean, the thing that stops us is actually we don't have any sort of consensus.
We don't want to, right?
That is what stops us. Yeah, and that's why we can't leave here with solutions, because we just aren't. And, naively and hopefully, I want to ask the historian, like, what are the chances? I mean, do we have any hope of ever having that and that's interesting too, because it's more complex. Truth and reconciliation is more complex than it seems on the surface. There's good and bad in that, and but yes, naively, I want to think that if only we could do that, if only we could have that consensus. So I guess I'm going to open this up to questions if you guys are okay with that, and I'm going to start with the question of without consensus, and this may mean you repeating some of what you've already said, what is our move? Like, what are we doing? If we're doing this without consensus, how do we try to move that needle? How do we try to make this move forward instead of what feels like at this moment moving backwards? Like, how do we at the very least put the brakes on? So there's a big question.
I mean, I honestly think it really starts from conversation. You know, I mean, that's what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was really based on a psychoanalytic model. You know, like that literally that if one stands up and if you know, a citizen could, you know, citizen after citizen after citizen was testifying. And the testimony itself was some form of catharsis for the nation.
Right.
And I think that because we've had this history that we started talking about in the very beginning of like the Dallas way, the Fort Worth way, a certain kind of erasure, or to even displace some conversations. So like, oh, it's not actually, it's just about money, you know, or
yeah, don't take it personally. This
right.
is business. What's good for Dallas?
Yeah, and so I think it's actually just about acknowledging real differences. You know, you don't jump to consensus. You first have to recognize the actual difference that exists. And I think that's honestly has to be the first step. So yes, there's a lot of things that have moved backwards, but I honestly think, you know, like we talk about this political moment as a retreat, but I actually think that it's been a moment that sort of revealed something that has always been present. It's not as if like those white supremacists were like, you know, birthed, you know, out of some kind of immaculate conception.
Like, where'd they come
you know,
from?
like,
Yeah.
They came from real people, real parents, real communities, real ideologies that have been consistent for centuries.
Yeah.
You know, like they just felt empowered to do it more publicly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when things come to the light, then, you know, that's the great antiseptic. Yeah.
I mean, for sure, the slow process of education and opening up history and exposing that more is definitely like beneficial. But I also think like when we talk about other countries, we're talking about countries that have a history of start and stop, and having a moment. Exactly, revolution. Okay, didn't want to say it, but you know, and so we've kind of been in this like ongoing nightmare dream. Like, we really haven't like slept.
Dream, yeah.
We haven't, you know. So I mean, on one end, like I have an 8-year-old, so I'm very much like, you know, watching him grow up, watching him say like, I'm not identifying today, and I'm like, where did you get this conversation? Like, we haven't had this. Like, do I write it down in your book? And like, he doesn't even know it. Like, it's in the ether, you know. But there's something that kids are downloading, and as we downloaded, right? But the idea that this feels like one just long struggle, I'm not as optimistic about the idea of reaching consensus. One thing I want to say is that a friend that works on the Hill in Washington, D.C., he works for a bipartisan policy institute, so that means we have a lot of arguments. And he was saying that how the day that the Kavanaugh hearings were happening, he just so happened to have to go to this conservative think tank. And he said he walked out, and in the lobby, there were tons of people there crying, you know? And they were crying not because they were on a certain side that he was on. They were crying because they felt bad for Kavanaugh. They were like, you know. And so when he saw that, it really messed him up, you know, actually working in this sort of institution and being like, you know, basically it's like, we're kind of fucked, you know? Like, I mean, when you have sort of this sort of polarized views of the world, and this is just sort of a little microcosm, this issue, that no amount of talking to each other seems to solve, you know? And I'm not sure about that, how that...
Well, I mean, I don't know, the thing that occurs to me, and again, this could be completely Pollyanna, but it feels like that when things are at a boiling point, something is about to happen. I mean, we're at least, I mean, I keep saying in hopes that it's true that this is the last gasp of a dying empire, you know, that's why people are fighting so hard on either side, because everything's at stake, and just making sure that in the end, where we land is someplace we all want to live, you know.
But as long as Walker, Texas Ranger is like on Netflix, you know, then we also have that problem. Like,
well,
you know,
but you know, that's the thing is like to note, and thanks Terry for letting us ask questions, right? But that, you know, I think about that too. Like, we can't erase Texas, what's his name, Ranger.
Walker, Texas Ranger.
That's it. Yeah, we can't erase that either. We have to. You know, maybe we can tear it down and fill it up with other stuff, but I don't know. Okay, I really am opening it up for questions. So surely you guys have been developing thoughts. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering if any of you have had contact with the Daughters of the American Revolution here in Texas, and how strong of a force are they? Are they a dying breed, or are they digging in their heels in terms of the monuments that they want preserved?
The Confederacy or the American Revolution?
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, the Daughters of the Confederacy.
Or the Republic
right,
of Texas.
Exactly.
I'll just give you this little note. I was on accident the Daughters of American Revolution's first Black middle school outstanding student of the year.
Wow,
Back in the 90s.
that was the
It was
start
an
of
accident. They didn't realize I was
everything.
Black till I showed up, and they were like, "Wait, what's going on?" Oops. And it was actually kind of an issue.
Destined to be. You
Yeah.
had no choice in your fate. Wow.
Yeah, it was kind of an issue that I was kept from, but there was negotiations happening before I received my medal. I didn't realize it until my parents told me after, but yeah. They're not a dying breed, apparently. They still give out medals to middle school students.
But I mean the Confederacy, the Daughters of the
Confederacy.
Confederacy, because aren't they a strong force here or not in terms of preserving Confederate monuments?
Sure. Please.
So in about 97 or 98, I wrote a piece for a magazine called The Met about the Lee statue at Lee Park. And the Daughters of the Confederacy were trying to raise some money to refurbish it. And I was about 26 years old, and I wrote a piece saying maybe we should just take it down. And this was before social media and email and everything. And my phone at the Met blew up with these women. And they just ripped me a new one day after day after day. And that was 96, 97, which was a while back, but they were still going strong then.
Yeah, and I mean, they're active
This was
in...
a little bitty paper. I mean, this was not like the Dallas Morning News.
But it was
They
on
haven't been publicly active as a force, like they haven't come out as the Daughters of the Confederates, but they have been behind the scenes offering funding to address things. So it's still an existing organization that I think is sort of like worked its way into other organizations, but
I will
Yeah.
say that the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, for generations, has been very active in commemoration, including the Alamo, right? They controlled the Alamo, which we didn't even get to the Alamo.
No, this was such a futile act, wasn't it?
So finally, the state's taking over the Alamo, right? From the reclaiming their national heritage from the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. But I think that's probably something they're upset about it, right? But it's pretty safe that Greg Abbott's state of Texas is going to continue to make the Alamo great.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for you, friends. So I'm really interested in this question of the not so long standing of the monuments, but I'm interested in this question of like new monuments because I one day happened to come back into the United States, into my workplace, and then walk into a place where trees are adorned with blue ribbons, for example, right? Or people's monumentalizing particular kinds of things in cars, right? So that you're driving, and all of a sudden you see all of these things. And so I wonder about this question of the idea of the sort of like the monument as the, like the state enshrined monument, but also the monuments that I think for me are a little bit more insidious because they kind of like attack you when you know what I mean, when you least expect it. You're leaving like the supermarket and there is the, whatever it is, or I don't know, what do you guys think about that? And the process in which people monumentalize particular kinds of things, right? So one event, one thing, then becomes a rallying cry, and then you get a symbol, and then, because monumentalizing is not a thing of the past, it's a thing that we do every single day, right? And so I wonder if you talked about that process. What is monumentalizing, and then these other monuments that just kind of like spring up.
I mean, that's what American Monument is all,
Right.
all about.
Right.
So for me, my interest in monumentality is really looking at what's the new materials of monumentality. And because I am a new media maker, my thing is like, how do we insert breath or life into these materials that feel dead? But also knowing that my monuments aren't meant to last if an alien apocalypse happens and it's like not gonna like be here anymore. I mean, Robert E. Lee will still be here, buried in the dirt, you know? But like my little new media monuments need power, you know? But I do think that these materials are what I'm questioning the idea of our need to monumentalize. And also the difference between state power monuments versus other types of monuments as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think, well, you know, it takes a lot of work to try to get state official monuments created, right? But I do think that's a worthwhile fight. It's a permanent change in the built environment, right? You're walking down the street and suddenly you're not reading about oil barons and cattle barons, and instead you get to actually see some real history. So I think we should take opportunities like that and take advantage of them. So there's a great kind of people's history of the stockyards in North Fort Worth that remains to be told, and of the Union up there, and those are some things I think we should mark. Or to take another example, you know, I've been very impressed from a distance at the work that the Equal Justice Initiative has done in Montgomery with the Lynching Museum and Memorial, or, you know, the older Maya Lin one at the Southern Poverty Law Center. You know, those are kind of grassroots and community-based, right, efforts at monuments that I think maybe they work because they resonate on that same valence as some of these other bronze busts, but and maybe there's some negatives to that too. But to me, it's worthwhile to contest those big mega projects too, and from the ground up.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're operating, Lauren, more on the level of the conversation. That's your material in a way, is the...
Yeah, and I mean, I'm very like particular. I call it a monument. I mean, it's it's
you're
housed,
claiming.
I'm
monument.
claiming it.
Yeah.
So the project is how do I transform existing structures into a monument, sort of this nomadic monument thing. So the material is traveling, but I'm not dependent on some sort of $1 million capital project to like have some sort of staying power. And I mean, the thing that kind of gives me a little bit of, or what I sort of point to is I think, you know, if the Earth does have an alien apocalypse and things blow up, what will remain is actually this Carl Sagan record that's out in outer space. Right. So that's a monument and it's new media.
Well, that's interesting.
So like, you know, that's what I'm sort of taking that on. But yeah, so there's been a lot of conversations about whether this is really a monument, like getting people onto the idea of calling it a monument. Some people call it a meta monument, but it really is about the conversation of monumentality at its like most, you know, sort of general level before we get into the specifics of what the monument is about.
I want to say something about the consensus part, right? Which is that we aren't going to reach consensus. Right? If you have two people, you probably won't, right, on most issues. Certainly not as a nation. So I think at a certain point we have to think about power. We have to think about winning, right? We have to think about you know, the fact that to reflect on the current moment. Like for me, people are awakening to the idea that we don't live in a democracy, right? And that's unsettling, right? And I think what we need then is to democratize our political culture, and we can do that through art and through this process, right? But ultimately, what you need is enough resources that you can mobilize on your side to win. And there's going to be other people with hurt feelings. But you know, giving up power and privilege is a difficult process.
So ultimately, so you win until the next time when you lose. So
well, you don't win by dominating. You win by actually creating a democratic culture, right? And we have no experience with that here.
Right. Wow. Yes.
Way up in the back?
Yes, way up in the back.
I have a question. What do you think changed? Because certainly these statues, monuments stood unmolested for over 100 years. So why are they now coming down?
Black Lives Matters.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It always has. I mean, I figure they've always been hurtful points of sensitivity.
But you're saying the actual formation of that.
Yeah, I mean, the movement for Black Lives is definitely this boiling point we've sort of gotten to with the movement of for Black Lives, and you know, the years under Obama, and like, you know, I think what you were saying in terms of this became an object to sort of project what is the material reality of what's going on right now onto it. So if we think about the very first sort of what spawned this whole thing was that first action of Bree Newsom climbing up the pole and taking the flag down, which is getting sort of historicized as a singular person doing that, but that was actually a group of people who strategized, decided to put her as the person to climb up the pole because of who she represented bodily, you know, to do that. That's what jumped this whole thing off, you know, and it was that spectacle, right?
And then there have been different approaches, right? So there's Mr. Hudspeth and the years-long battle at the county commission, right? And then, you know, the folks in Durham, North Carolina, who just went out there with a rope and pulled it down, right? And said, we're done with this. And we didn't ask anyone for permission. And yeah, it's clearly that's that larger movement. It's the backlash to Obama.
Yeah.
And again, this is true every time. The creation of these Confederate monuments around the turn of the century, you know, late 1890s and into really up through World War I, that was a moment which we misunderstand. I'm a historian. I'm going to lecture you all for a minute, right?
Good.
Jim Crow was not invented in 1865. It took a whole generation of struggle, and it was invented with the explicit purpose around the turn of the century of white elites trying to pit white workers against black workers. Right? That was the point of Jim Crow, to get white folks to identify with their racial identity and not to question the power relations of the class system and of the new states they had just created, the new constitutions they had just created. It was about solidifying a new political order. And so these monuments had nothing to do with Confederate soldiers, right? What they were was justification for lynching in the present moment. And today, right, they stand as justifications for police lynchings, right? And that's why they're being attacked by activists.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways the Charlottesville chant of like Jews will not replace us
Right.
was really about that. It was like that there was a threat of like replacing my agency, my power, my place as a worker, my place of accumulating wealth and power in any shape or form.
And that's literally the history of Dallas at the turn of the century, was sort of that same when the Klan sort of settled into city politics. And at that point, the business council decided to offer whiteness to the Jewish community, right? And so, yeah, it's all of that.
Well, it took a while.
It took a while.
But right, we had Ku Klux Klan Day at the State Fair right, throughout the 1920s.
But I will say in Dallas, so just like, you know, in Denton, Mr. Hudspeth has been doing this for 20 years. In Dallas, the first moment that's on the record of trying to address the Confederate monuments was actually in the 90s. And it was a white sort of, I can't remember what he does for a living. It's totally unrelated, but he's sort of an amateur, not amateur, but like a hobby historian who decided to go to the city and try to get these down. And he did petitions, he was there all the time, and he's actually been involved in the Take It Down movement as well, sort of in the background. But he started that in the 90s.
That was so good, and it was the beginning. Like we said, we're wanting to start a conversation with this, and I think hopefully there's more of this to come. And thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you so much for doing that.